Elisa Lam was born on April 30th, 1991, in Vancouver, British Columbia. She was the daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong and grew up in a bilingual household. Elisa was a bright and curious child, often described by those who knew her as intelligent and introspective. She had a passion for literature and writing, which she expressed through her online blogs. As she entered her teenage years, Elisa began to struggle with mental health issues. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, conditions that she openly discussed in her blog posts. Despite these challenges, Elisa was determined to live a fulfilling life. She enrolled at the University of British Columbia, where she pursued her studies while continuing to manage her mental health. Elisa's writings revealed a young woman who was deeply self-aware and candid about her experiences. She often wrote about her feelings of isolation, her battles with self-doubt, and her desire to connect with others. Her blog served as both a creative outlet and a means of coping with her inner turmoil. In late January 2013, Elisa decided to embark on a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She viewed this journey as an opportunity for personal growth and adventure. Her itinerary included stops in San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Cruz, and San Francisco. She kept in touch with her family throughout her travels, providing regular updates on her experiences. On January 26, 2013, Elisa checked into the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The hotel, known for its checkered past and proximity to Skid Row, had been rebranded as the Stay on Main in an effort to attract a younger clientele. Elisa was initially assigned to a shared room, but was moved to a private room after her roommates complained about her unusual behavior. During her stay at the Cecil Hotel, Elisa visited various tourist attractions and continued to communicate with her family. However, on January 31st, she failed to contact her parents, which was uncharacteristic of her. Concerned for her safety, her family reported her missing to the Los Angeles Police Department. The search for Elisa began immediately. Police officers conducted a thorough investigation, including interviews with hotel staff and guests, as well as a search of the premises. Despite their efforts, there was no sign of Elisa. Her disappearance garnered media attention, and flyers with her photo were distributed throughout the area. As days turned into weeks, the mystery surrounding Elisa's disappearance deepened. The lack of evidence and leads left both her family and the public desperate for answers. The case took a dramatic turn when the police released surveillance footage from one of the hotel's elevators, recorded on January 31st. In the video, Elisa is seen entering the elevator and pressing multiple buttons. She exhibits erratic behavior, including peering out of the elevator, stepping in and out, and making unusual hand gestures. The footage quickly went viral, sparking widespread speculation and numerous theories about her actions and fate. The elevator video raised more questions than it answered. Some viewers believed Elisa was being pursued by someone, while others suggested she was experiencing a mental health crisis. The unsettling nature of the footage captivated audiences worldwide and intensified interest in the case. Despite the public's fascination and the ongoing investigation, Elisa remained missing. Her family continued to hope for her safe return, clinging to the belief that she would be found alive. The uncertainty and lack of closure were agonizing for those who knew and loved her. On February 19, 2013, nearly 3 weeks after Elisa's disappearance, a hotel maintenance worker responded to complaints about low water pressure and strange-tasting water. Upon inspecting the rooftop water tanks, he discovered Elisa's body floating inside one of the cisterns. She was nude, with her clothes and personal belongings found nearby. The discovery of Elisa's body shocked the public and reignited media coverage of the case. Questions arose about how she had accessed the restricted rooftop area and entered the water tank. The hotel's security measures, including locked doors and alarm systems, were scrutinized. An autopsy was conducted to determine the cause of death. The results revealed no signs of physical trauma, sexual assault, or foul play. Toxicology tests showed traces of her prescribed medications, but no illegal substances. The coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder identified as a significant contributing factor. Despite the official ruling, many people remain skeptical. The circumstances of Elisa's death, combined with the eerie elevator footage, fueled numerous conspiracy theories. Some speculated about paranormal involvement, while others questioned the thoroughness of the investigation. Elisa's tragic story continues to captivate and haunt those who learn about it. Her case has been the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and countless online discussions. The Cecil Hotel's dark history and the mysterious nature of Elisa's death have solidified her story as one of the most enigmatic and unsettling cases in recent memory. The Cecil Hotel was already a place with a reputation long before Elisa Lam ever walked through its doors. Opened in 1924 in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, the Cecil was once considered a symbol of architectural pride, a stylish, marble-floored structure that stood 13 stories tall. In its early decades, it had catered to business travelers and tourists, offering easy access to LA's growing city center. But as the years went on, the neighborhood around it began to shift. The area became darker, rougher. Skid Row, just blocks away, grew in size, and with it came homelessness, poverty, and addiction. By the 1980s, the Cecil had transformed into something else entirely. Its once pristine lobby still hinted at the glamour of the past, but the upper floors had turned into low-income housing. The hotel operated with a dual identity, part tourist lodge, part residential shelter. The result was a complicated place where long-term tenants shared elevators with backpackers, and social workers sometimes visited as often as guests did. This backdrop was part of what made Elisa Lam's decision to stay there so unusual. By 2013, the hotel had rebranded part of itself as the Stay on Main, offering younger travelers a more affordable place to sleep while distancing them from the building's past. But the separation was mostly cosmetic. The lobby was shared. The elevators were shared. The walls, the hallways, the rooftop, they were all still part of the original Cecil. And so were its stories. The Cecil Hotel was infamous not just for its location, but for the number of violent and unexplained events that had occurred within its walls. In the 1930s alone, a series of suicides had taken place there, guests jumping from upper windows onto the sidewalk below. The 1940s and 50s brought more of the same: overdoses, disappearances, gunshots. In the 1960s, a woman known as Pigeon Goldie was murdered in her room. The crime was brutal. The case remains unsolved. And in later decades, it was discovered that serial killers had stayed there. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, had reportedly lived on the 14th floor for a time in 1985 during his killing spree. Another suspected killer, Jack Unterweger, booked a room at the Cecil while targeting sex workers across Los Angeles in the 1990s. These details weren't front and center in the hotel's advertising, but they lingered in the atmosphere, in the unease some visitors felt, in the way people looked over their shoulders in the hallway. And while Elisa likely hadn't known the full extent of its past, the choice to stay there placed her in the middle of a place with more than its share of shadow. In the days following her disappearance, the building's layout and history became part of the investigation. The hotel had multiple entry points and exits. Some were monitored, others weren't. There were security cameras, but not on every floor. Elevators moved slowly and sometimes stalled. Certain stairwells were locked from the inside, others left open. And the rooftop, where Elisa would eventually be found, was supposed to be inaccessible to guests. Access required a key. An alarm would sound if a door was opened. That was the official story. But investigators discovered that some pathways weren't secured as tightly as reported. A fire escape ran along the side of the building, and if someone knew where to climb, or had no fear of doing so, it was possible to reach the roof unnoticed. It's still unclear if Elisa knew this, or if someone else did. During the initial search, hotel staff and police officers combed the interior of the building. They searched her room. They questioned employees. They asked other guests if they had seen or heard anything, but the search was limited. No one checked the inside of the rooftop water tanks. Not then. Not yet. What investigators did find was her personal belongings. Her laptop, her wallet, medication, books, clothes. Nothing looked out of place, except for her absence. It was in this context that the elevator video was released. The grainy surveillance footage, dated January 31st, captured just over 2 minutes of Elisa's final known moments. She enters the elevator and presses several buttons quickly, as if unsure which floor she's headed to. The doors remain open longer than expected. She looks outside, steps in and out of view, hides in the corner, waves her hands in strange motions, and finally leaves. She's never seen again. The clip went viral almost immediately. It wasn't just because she was missing. It was how she behaved, the stiffness in her movement, the way she looked into the hallway, the strange, almost childlike gesturing with her hands. Some viewers believed she was hiding. Others thought she was hallucinating. A few were certain she was being followed. And still others, reaching further, pointed to paranormal activity. Ghosts. Possession. Something inhuman. The truth was harder to grasp. The video didn't explain anything, but it deepened the mystery. It became the central image of the case. A young woman, alone in a hotel known for tragedy, behaving in a way no one could understand. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Elisa Lam moved through Los Angeles like any young traveler might. Curious, observant, keeping records of her time in the city through photos, receipts, and the occasional note to her family. She visited bookstores, took public transportation, bought small things, souvenirs, food, stamps. She was alone but not withdrawn. She made casual conversation with store clerks and guests. She smiled in photos. And yet, underneath the surface, something more complicated was unfolding. Elisa had always been open about her struggles. Her blog, which she updated regularly under a pseudonym, had become a space where she could express herself without fear of judgment. She wrote candidly about depression, about feeling directionless, about the cycles of medication and side effects, about how hard it could be to keep moving forward when the inside of her mind didn't always match the outside of her life. But she also wrote with warmth, humor, and intelligence. She spoke about fashion, music, and books. She admired authors like Chuck Palahniuk and Sylvia Plath, writers who, like her, didn't shy away from pain. Her posts were reflective, sometimes heavy, sometimes hopeful. Above all, they were honest. They revealed a young woman trying to understand herself and trying to stay afloat. This transparency is part of why so many people connected with Elisa's story. She wasn't a mystery when she was alive. She was a person who had shared what she was feeling. And yet, after her disappearance, many who came to know her through those posts treated her as a puzzle. During her time in Los Angeles, Elisa had made a habit of contacting her parents every day. Sometimes by email, sometimes by phone. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. Her family had supported her decision to travel, but they worried. She was open with them about her health, her medication, and her fears. And for the first part of the trip, she reassured them. Until she didn't. On January 31st, Elisa failed to check in. Her parents waited, then called, then reported her missing. It wasn't like her. Not even during depressive spells. Not even when she felt overwhelmed. She always called. And so, while the investigation began at the hotel, others began retracing her steps. Credit card statements, MetroPass logs, social media, conversations, a photograph taken at a bookstore not far from the hotel. By all accounts, her last known interaction showed her smiling. The store clerk said she'd been friendly. She had purchased books and gifts for her family. Nothing had seemed strange, but timelines are thin when someone vanishes alone. From the bookstore, she returned to the Cecil. And then nothing. No confirmed sightings. No other footage. No trace. Just the elevator video, captured sometime that evening. There are moments in the footage, moments that viewers have returned to over and over, where Elisa moves with strange deliberateness. She seems to check the hallway, as though expecting someone to follow. She presses against the elevator wall. She speaks, though there's no audio. Her hands move in looping, sweeping gestures. To some, it looked like fear. To others, it looked like psychosis. To a few, it looked like something not of this world. But to those familiar with bipolar disorder, it looked painfully familiar. Her behavior, erratic, disoriented, anxious, was not uncommon during the manic phase of a bipolar episode, particularly if her medication had been interrupted or was out of balance. Elisa had been prescribed multiple medications to stabilize her condition: mood stabilizers, antidepressants, antipsychotics. Her journals reflected moments of stability, followed by self-doubt. She had sometimes resisted taking her medication consistently, not out of recklessness, but because of how they made her feel, blunted, slowed, not herself. The truth is, it remains unclear what her medication regimen looked like in those final days. Whether she had skipped doses, whether she had adjusted anything on her own, whether the pressure of travel, of being alone in an unfamiliar place, had magnified her existing vulnerabilities. What is known is that her online voice, the one so many discovered after the fact, sounded like someone searching for clarity. Not attention, not escape, clarity. And that voice is part of what makes her story so hard to forget. Because the tragedy of Elisa Lam isn't found only in the way her life ended. It's found in the things she left behind, the half-finished entries, the candid admissions, the way she tried to bridge the gap between her inner life and the world around her. She was not unknowable. She told people who she was. But in the final days of her life, she became unseen. And in the stillness of a grainy elevator video, that absence became permanent. When Elisa Lam was officially reported missing on February 1st, 2013, the response from law enforcement was immediate, but not yet urgent. Young adults go missing in major cities often, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, many of them reappearing after confusion, a lapse in communication, or simply the desire to be alone. But Elisa's case didn't follow that path. Her family, still in Vancouver, knew something was wrong. They hadn't just lost contact with her, they felt a shift. She had been too consistent, too careful, too open about where she was, what she was doing, and when she'd check in next. The Los Angeles Police Department took their report seriously. Officers visited the Cecil Hotel, questioned staff, and obtained security footage from various locations throughout the building. They began by focusing on the most immediate possibilities: that Elisa had left voluntarily, that she had gone to meet someone, or that she had suffered a medical or psychological episode somewhere on or near the premises. The working theory was incomplete, but in those early hours, investigators believed she had likely left the hotel alive. But then something happened. Days passed. No activity on her phone. No bank withdrawals. No camera sightings. No social media posts. Nothing. And as the silence stretched into a week, the tone of the investigation changed. The LAPD expanded their efforts. Missing person flyers went up around downtown. Her face, framed by dark hair and a soft smile, appeared in bus shelters and store windows. Police canvassed the area, interviewed local businesses, and checked city hospitals. Volunteers joined the search. Elisa's family flew to Los Angeles to help, holding on to the hope that their daughter would walk through the doors at any moment, explaining everything. She didn't, and the search kept narrowing. The Cecil Hotel itself became the central focus. Its history, already complex and dark, was now back under the lens of public attention. Officers revisited Elisa's room, which she had been moved to after her original roommates complained of unusual behavior. They interviewed other guests on her floor, but no one reported anything definitive. She had been seen. She had said little. Nothing had stood out. The building's structure was a challenge. Its old architecture included narrow stairwells, irregularly placed hallways, low-lit corners, and a confusing elevator system. Some doors were locked. Others weren't. The rooftop, allegedly off-limits, was reachable by fire escape for anyone determined or disoriented enough to climb. The staff, while helpful, couldn't account for every movement inside the building. It was simply too large and too porous. That sense of uncertainty began to take hold. Had she never left the hotel? Had something happened behind one of those locked doors? Was she hiding, or being hidden, within the very building where the search had begun? The release of the elevator video on February 14th marked a turning point, not in the investigation itself, but in the public's relationship to the case. Until then, Elisa's disappearance had been a tragedy followed mostly by her family, a few determined detectives, and a slowly growing group of concerned online users. But when the surveillance footage appeared on news outlets and social media platforms, it captured something people hadn't expected: movement without clarity, behavior without context. The video's grainy black and white quality, the seemingly malfunctioning elevator doors, Elisa's body language, hesitant, fearful, then erratic, sparked a flood of attention. Millions of views followed, comment sections filled with guesses, armchair theories, personal interpretations. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It became viral, and with that attention came consequences. Some viewers began to scrutinize every frame of the video, applying filters, adjusting the speed, making lists of possible interpretations. Others created entire timelines based on her hand gestures, the placement of her feet, the pattern of the elevator buttons she pressed. A few users took it further, insisting she had been followed or manipulated or forced into something beyond her control. And in that tidal wave of speculation, the official investigation struggled to keep control of the narrative. Inside the hotel, police were still searching. They brought in search dogs. They checked every hallway, every unlocked room, every service closet. They moved from floor to floor, knocking on doors, opening stairwell exits, inspecting fire escapes. But at no point in the first 2 weeks did they check the rooftop water tanks. That part of the building was supposed to be secure. It required access through a locked door. An alarm system was meant to trigger if opened. And the tanks themselves, large industrial cylinders used to supply the building with water, were heavy, sealed with metal lids, and not built for easy entry. But on February 19th, a maintenance worker climbed up to the roof after receiving complaints about water pressure and discoloration. The guests had been reporting odd smells. Their showers were weak. The sink water tasted strange. He walked to the tanks, opened one of the metal lids, and saw what no one had expected. Elisa was inside. On the morning of February 19, 2013, a hotel maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez was sent to the roof of the Cecil Hotel to investigate an issue that had, up until then, seemed like a routine complaint. Several guests had reported poor water pressure in their bathrooms. Others noted that the tap water tasted unpleasant and had an odd color. In an aging building like the Cecil, where outdated plumbing was a known problem, these concerns didn't initially suggest anything unusual. Still, standard protocol required the building's rooftop water tanks to be checked. Lopez climbed a narrow staircase, exited through a rooftop door, and crossed the flat concrete surface toward the 4 large cisterns that supplied water to the hotel's guest rooms, kitchen, and shared facilities. The tanks were cylindrical, tall, and made of metal, positioned upright on a grid of metal supports. Each tank stood several feet high, with a heavy lid resting at the top. They were not designed to be easily accessed, certainly not by guests. In theory, the rooftop was secured, the entrance locked, and the tanks themselves sealed. But that morning, something wasn't right. One of the lids had been shifted slightly out of place. Lopez approached, lifted the metal cover fully, and looked inside. There, submerged in the tank, was the body of Elisa Lam, nude, motionless, lying face up in the water. Her clothing and belongings were found nearby, floating close by inside the tank. It was a discovery that changed everything. News of Elisa's recovery spread quickly, both through official channels and the rapidly growing online communities that had been following the case. Theories that had once been speculative now had a focal point. She had never left the building. She had been there the entire time, resting above the search efforts, hidden in a place few had considered looking. And yet, the answers didn't come with that discovery. If anything, the questions only deepened. How had she gotten up there? The door to the rooftop was supposed to be locked and alarmed. Staff maintained that any unauthorized access would have triggered a loud building-wide alert. Yet no such alarm had sounded. The fire escape could have been used to reach the roof from an external window, but it required physical effort and coordination, not something one would expect from someone in the throes of psychological distress. Then there was the tank itself. To reach it, Elisa would have needed to climb a ladder affixed to the tank's exterior. Once at the top, she would have had to remove the heavy metal lid, unassisted, and then lower herself into the dark, confined water chamber. The difficulty of that act, both physically and psychologically, was not easily dismissed. These weren't the choices of someone confused or afraid. They suggested purpose or desperation, or something else entirely. There were no clear signs of injury on her body. No wounds, no bruises, no indications that she had been attacked or restrained. Her clothing was in the tank, but not on her body, a detail that puzzled investigators. There was no conclusive evidence as to whether she had undressed before or after entering the water. And there were no drugs or alcohol detected in her system, beyond the presence of her prescribed medications. The autopsy report, released weeks later, confirmed what many already feared. Elisa had died by drowning. There was no physical trauma, no signs of sexual assault, no indication of foul play, at least not in the way investigators typically defined it. The toxicology report showed a limited amount of her prescribed medication, less than expected, in fact, raising questions about whether she had been taking it consistently. The coroner ultimately ruled her death as accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. But that conclusion, while medically sound, did not settle the matter for many who had followed the case. To the public, to Elisa's family, and to those who had seen the elevator video, the official explanation felt incomplete. They asked how a young woman, 5'5" and weighing just over 100 pounds, could have bypassed locked doors and alarm systems, scaled a rooftop structure, opened a heavy tank, and climbed inside without assistance, all while in the middle of a psychological crisis. They questioned why the search had failed to uncover her earlier, why the dogs brought in had not picked up her scent, why staff hadn't thought to check the water supply despite growing complaints. And perhaps most haunting of all, they wondered how long she had been in the tank before she was discovered. Because the answer to that question, 3 weeks, led to darker reflections. Guests had brushed their teeth, washed their faces, bathed and drank from water supplied by the very tanks that had held her body. That reality was not just unsettling. It was disturbing, and it added another layer to the strange, surreal weight of the case. The rooftop was photographed, examined, mapped, and discussed endlessly. So were the tanks, the stairwells, the fire escape, and the hallway leading from Elisa's room to the elevator. Investigators closed the case publicly. But for many, the story wasn't over. Not because they needed a villain, but because they couldn't understand how such a sequence of events could unfold inside a building, in the middle of a city, without anyone noticing. There was no note, no witness, no obvious explanation. Just a young woman, vanishing without a sound, and appearing weeks later in a place no one thought to look. The discovery of Elisa Lam's body on the rooftop of the Cecil Hotel did not bring the calm sense of resolution that the investigators may have hoped for. Instead, it sent the case spiraling into an even more tangled web of theories, questions, and public fascination. The details surrounding her death, already so strange and unsettling, only became more troubling in light of the hotel's response and the broader public reaction. Almost immediately after Elisa was found, the Cecil Hotel was thrust back into the public eye. Though it had quietly rebranded in previous years under the name Stay on Main, the rebranding now felt like an afterthought. The new name was rarely used in headlines. Everyone still referred to it as the Cecil, and for good reason. The building had long carried a reputation, but now, with the viral video of Elisa in the elevator and her body found in a sealed water tank, the hotel once again became the epicenter of public attention, not just in Los Angeles, but globally. Journalists arrived at the scene, standing outside the entrance with cameras and microphones, describing the strange history of the building and its growing connection to tragedy. Passers-by stopped to take photos. Tourists booked rooms out of morbid curiosity. And online, the case erupted into something larger than anyone could have anticipated. While the LAPD had closed the case, ruling it accidental, many people were not ready to accept that explanation. The strange nature of Elisa's behavior in the elevator, combined with the location of her body and the inconsistencies in hotel security, left a wide open space for doubt. That doubt quickly became a breeding ground for speculation. Within days, message boards and forums were filled with analyses, some methodical and grounded, others deeply speculative and unfounded. Amateur detectives pored over the elevator footage, dissecting every movement Elisa made, searching for hidden meanings in her gestures, in her posture, in the timing of the elevator doors. Theories ranged from the plausible, suggesting a severe bipolar episode or a breakdown triggered by travel fatigue and the stress of isolation, to the extreme. Some believed she had been chased. Others claimed she was reacting to a presence only she could see. A few went further, invoking paranormal explanations or pointing to the hotel's history as evidence of something sinister at play. The most viral theories weren't necessarily the most reasonable, but they were the ones that lingered. Some users connected her death to past crimes in the building, drawing comparisons to Richard Ramirez, the so-called Night Stalker, who had once lived on an upper floor. Others pointed to long-abandoned folklore about the Cecil being cursed or haunted. None of these theories were grounded in evidence, but they took root in a space where answers were incomplete and discomfort was high. The fact that Elisa had bipolar disorder and had been taking medication to manage it was, for many, not enough of an explanation. The toxicology report showed that she was likely under-medicated at the time of her death, but that alone didn't fully explain how she accessed the roof, how she entered the tank, and why no one heard or saw anything. Her family, still in mourning, remained largely private in the months following her death. But eventually, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the hotel. The legal claim argued that the Cecil had failed in its duty to protect guests, pointing to gaps in security, the roof's supposed alarm system, and the fact that Elisa had been able to access the tanks at all. The hotel's legal team pushed back, stating that there was no reasonable expectation that someone would access the roof or climb into a water tank, especially without assistance. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2015, with the court ruling that the death was unforeseeable. But to the public, the legal decision didn't remove the unease. If anything, it reinforced the idea that something had been missed. The Cecil Hotel never fully recovered from the case. While some guests continued to stay there out of financial necessity or curiosity, others avoided it entirely. The name alone came to represent something heavy, more than just a building with a dark past. It became a symbol of the unexplained, a place where something happened that no one could fully understand. In the years that followed, documentaries were made. Podcasts discussed the case in minute detail. YouTube videos recounted the timeline, offered visual reconstructions, speculated on possible timelines, and reviewed autopsy reports line by line. Even Netflix released a docuseries, blending fact with commentary, dramatizing the events while trying to stay tethered to what little was definitively known. And through it all, the image of Elisa, standing in that elevator, uncertain, moving in and out of the frame, remained the defining visual. It was the last time she was seen alive. It was the moment people returned to, again and again, trying to decipher what her gestures meant, what she was seeing, what she was feeling. To some, that moment revealed fear. To others, confusion. To others still, it was the moment before something irreversible happened. There was no definitive evidence of a crime. No suspect. No physical injuries. No sign of another person's involvement. But there was still discomfort. The way she was found. The delay in discovering her body. The questions about the hotel's infrastructure. The mystery of her final moments, forever captured on surveillance footage. It wasn't only the circumstances of her death that unsettled people. It was the possibility that no one had noticed. That a person could vanish in the middle of a city, in the center of a crowded hotel, and remained missing for weeks while people walked beneath her, drank from the water above her, and lived their lives just feet away from where hers had quietly ended. That realization, more than anything, was what stayed with people. The haunting possibility of being overlooked. Long after the media coverage slowed and the online theories began to lose momentum, one question quietly returned to the center of the story. Who is Elisa Lam? Outside of the footage, outside of the tank, outside of the building that seemed to swallow her? For a time, it had been easy for the public to forget. In the viral retelling of her final days, Elisa became less of a person and more of an image. A figure moving strangely inside a malfunctioning elevator, a name attached to conspiracy, a puzzle for strangers to solve. But those who knew her, her family, her friends, her readers, had never seen her that way. They had known her as something softer, fuller, more complete. She was 21 years old when she disappeared. She had been studying at the University of British Columbia. She had been open about her struggles with bipolar disorder and depression, but she was also deeply engaged with the world around her. Her blog, Ether Fields, captured her interior life in remarkable ways. Through it, she shared her thoughts on books, fashion, relationships, the uncertainty of adulthood, and the longing for connection that threaded through nearly all of her writing. She didn't mask what she felt. She didn't pretend to be more stable than she was. Her posts reflected both the weight she carried and the humor she used to move through it. They were not cries for help. They were reflections, honest, sharp, often painfully insightful. And in that honesty, she built a quiet audience of readers who saw something familiar in her words. In one entry, Elisa wrote about the fear of being average. In another, she explored the way her illness made her feel disconnected from her peers. She worried about the future, about being alone, about being misunderstood. But she also wrote about moments of joy, seeing a good movie, finding a book she loved, imagining what it would be like to feel understood without having to explain herself. Elisa was trying to live as best as she could, inside a body and mind that didn't always cooperate. That fact often disappears in the retelling of her story. But it mattered. Her decision to travel was born out of that desire to reclaim something. She had planned her trip along the West Coast carefully, stopping in cities she wanted to explore. She visited bookstores, art galleries, coffee shops. She stayed in hostels, met new people, took photos. She updated her blog with observations and thoughts. She bought souvenirs for her family. She tried, for a brief moment, to live a version of life that felt her own. Free, spontaneous, a little uncertain but full of possibility. There is no evidence that Elisa ever wanted to disappear. And yet, after her death, the conversations surrounding her often ignored the things she had shared about herself. The public focused on the footage, the tank, the theories. And in doing so, they often missed the person at the center of it all. It is easy to become consumed by a mystery, but harder to hold space for someone's complexity. Elisa was complex. She was not defined by her illness, though she spoke about it openly. She was not defined by her death, though it was tragic. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, a writer. She lived with fear, but also with hope. And she deserved to be remembered not for how she died, but for who she was in the quiet moments before that. In the years since, some efforts have been made to return the narrative to Elisa's perspective. Readers of her blog have collected her posts, not to sensationalize them, but to preserve them, respectfully, as a portrait of someone who mattered. Mental health advocates have pointed to her story as a reminder of how bipolar disorder can impact decision-making, perception, and memory, and how, even when someone appears composed on the outside, they may be carrying more than anyone realizes. Her family has remained private but consistent in their message, that Elisa was more than what happened to her, that her death, while strange and painful, should not eclipse the life she led before it. They have not participated in documentaries. They have not entertained speculation. They have not chased attention. They have asked only that their daughter be remembered fully. And slowly, that has begun to happen. For many people, the setting of a tragedy is as important as the events themselves. In Elisa Lam's case, that setting was the Cecil Hotel, an aging cement and brick structure standing in the center of downtown Los Angeles, where its silhouette had long loomed over the corner of Main Street and 7th. The Cecil had existed for nearly a century before Elisa ever walked through its lobby. And during those years, it had become more than just a hotel. It had become a symbol of neglect, of decay, of a certain kind of darkness that lingered not just in stories, but in the walls themselves. When it opened in 1924, the Cecil had been a modest beacon of glamour. Its marble lobby and high ceilings gave it the appearance of success, a place designed for businessmen and travelers coming through the growing city. But within a decade, the Great Depression had altered the area around it. The streets were no longer welcoming. Many of the city's most vulnerable citizens, people struggling with addiction, mental illness, poverty, began to cluster in what became known as Skid Row. And the Cecil, too large and too cheap to remain exclusive, began to reflect its surroundings. By the mid-20th century, the hotel had quietly acquired a reputation. There were too many deaths, too many overdoses, too many unexplained events. People jumped from windows. Others vanished. Murders happened behind closed doors. The kind of tragedies that, individually, might be forgotten over time. But together, they built a narrative the hotel could not shake. One of the most infamous guests was Richard Ramirez, the serial killer later dubbed the Night Stalker, who reportedly stayed in a room on the top floor during his killing spree in 1985. Another was Jack Unterweger, an Austrian journalist and convicted murderer who had also been linked to violent crimes while staying at the Cecil. These stories, stacked one on top of another, created the mythos. By the early 2000s, the hotel had attempted to rebrand. New signage went up. The upper floors were leased as apartments. Budget-conscious travelers were targeted under a different name, Stay on Main. Some cosmetic changes were made, colored walls, new furniture in the lobby, promotional photos for backpackers. But the bones of the building stayed the same. The elevators, the stairwells, the plumbing, the security systems, they had all aged. And the boundaries between the past and the present, between the long-term tenants and short-term guests, were blurry at best. When Elisa checked in, she was placed in a shared room with others. But after just one night, she was reassigned to a private room due to reports of strange behavior. What exactly happened remains unclear. The reports weren't formal. Staff described her as acting erratically, either in speech or in movement, but not aggressively. Just unusual. It was this change, from a shared space to a private one, that set in motion her final days at the hotel. After her disappearance and the discovery of her body, the hotel found itself under scrutiny once again. Investigators examined the physical structure. They noted the flaws in the alarm system, the ease with which someone could reach the rooftop by fire escape, the lack of consistent security patrols, and the minimal monitoring of guests' movements between floors. Though the official cause of death was accidental, the building's condition played a role in enabling that accident to occur without immediate detection. Outside, on the sidewalk below, the hotel's entrance became a place of quiet tension. Tourists stood at a distance. Some took photos. Others stood and stared, unsure what they were hoping to see. Locals continued to pass by. Most of them were used to the stories. The building had always been a background presence, silent, unmoved by its reputation. But for many people who followed Elisa's story, the hotel itself became inseparable from the mystery. Its structure, its history, its silence. That silence was what disturbed people the most. How a person could disappear inside a building in a major city and go undiscovered for weeks. How a death could occur just a few floors above occupied rooms, and how nothing in the building's design seemed to notice or stop it, or even sound the alarm. That silence, more than anything, was what haunted people. In 2017, the hotel was officially closed to the public. Renovations were announced. Management changed. There were plans to restore and repurpose the building, turn it into affordable housing, perhaps, or something new entirely. But even now, years later, the name still carries weight. Not because of marketing or design or location, but because of memory. The building has become a vessel for the stories people project onto it. A symbol of abandonment, of how things can fall through, of how people, even in full view of others, can go unnoticed until it's far too late. As the years passed, Elisa Lam's story took on a life of its own. It was no longer only about what had happened to her in the final days of January 2013, or the haunting image of her stepping in and out of an elevator in a downtown Los Angeles hotel. It had grown into something larger, more layered, and more difficult to hold in a single narrative. Her death, tragic and deeply personal, had become entangled with broader questions. Not just about what happened, but about how we tell stories like hers, about what it means when real people become puzzles, and what we lose when the person behind the mystery begins to disappear. At first, the internet treated her case like a crime to solve. The elevator video invited it. So did the setting. So did the silence. And so people began to dig. They searched her blog, her posts, her photos. They made timelines, mapped floor plans, theorized about hidden doors, false identities, ghosts, conspiracies. The attention wasn't always cruel, but it was relentless. Every frame of video became evidence. Every sentence she'd written online was turned over again and again, weighed for meaning. But none of it could explain what people were really searching for, something that would make the ending feel less senseless. But Elisa Lam was not a cipher. She was not a puzzle with a solution. She was a person, a young woman with bipolar disorder, who had spoken openly and intelligently about her struggles. She had shared her thoughts without shame. She had expressed fear and hope in equal measure. And yet, when her story spread, much of that vulnerability was overwritten by fascination. The public asked what happened to her. Fewer asked what it felt like to be her. That difference mattered. Over time, some people began to question that shift. Writers, educators, and mental health advocates stepped in to reframe the conversation. Not just around Elisa's case, but around how such stories are handled in the public eye. They pointed out how easily online communities can turn pain into entertainment, how the line between interest and intrusion is often blurred, how fascination with unsolved cases can sometimes come at the expense of the very people whose lives were lost. Elisa's story became a case study in that dynamic. Because her life was well documented through blog posts, journal entries, and personal reflections, people could, in theory, come closer to understanding her as a full human being. But instead, much of what she left behind was combed through for clues, stripped of context, and interpreted without the empathy it deserved. The elevator video, powerful as it was, became a trap of sorts. It kept the focus on a moment of confusion, not on the years of effort and care that preceded it. It narrowed her life to a few minutes of grainy footage. It made people forget that she had dreams, insecurities, humor, intelligence, and a family who loved her. Even the documentaries and media projects meant to honor her story had to walk a delicate line. Some managed it carefully, centering the voices of mental health professionals and those close to Elisa's life. Others, though unintentionally, perpetuated the same mystery-first framing that had dominated coverage from the beginning. They leaned into eerie music, dramatizations, slow zooms, and ominous narration. They focused on how strange the case was, not on how human she was. And yet, despite that, something else began to emerge alongside the spectacle. A kind of quiet correction. Readers of her blog started compiling her writing, not to dissect it, but to preserve it. Fans of her thoughtful posts wrote essays about what her honesty meant to them. People who had struggled with bipolar disorder themselves shared how Elisa's openness helped them feel less alone. They saw her not as an unsolved riddle, but as someone who had fought, every day, to exist in a world that didn't always understand people like her. Her legacy, for many, became not about how she died, but about how she lived, and what she had tried to communicate through her own words. Today, Elisa Lam's name is still widely recognized. But for many, the story has shifted. It's no longer only about the Cecil Hotel, or a strange video, or a rooftop water tank. It's also about the way stories are told, the way mental illness is portrayed, the way the internet responds to uncertainty. Her case opened a conversation, one that continues in classrooms, in mental health forums, in discussions about privacy, about dignity, and about the cost of turning pain into content. And for those who still follow the story, the most meaningful answer may not be about how she died. It may be in how we choose to remember her. By the time the official investigation into Elisa Lam's death concluded, many of the questions that had flooded the public sphere remained unanswered. Not because they had no answers, but because the form they took was often unanswerable. Theories that hinted at something darker, more elaborate, or somehow otherworldly had gathered so much momentum that when the final coroner's report arrived, calm and unembellished, it felt anticlimactic to many. But the investigation had done what it could, and though not every detail could be tied up neatly, the case, as defined by the legal system, was closed. The coroner's office listed the cause of death as accidental drowning, with Elisa's bipolar disorder noted as a significant contributing condition. No trauma had been found on her body, no signs of assault, no indication that another person had been involved. The toxicology report, though limited by the state of her remains after weeks in the water, showed only traces of her prescribed medication, perhaps not enough to fully manage her condition in the days leading up to her death. The LAPD had reviewed hotel security procedures and mapped out possible ways Elisa could have reached the roof. They confirmed that the rooftop doors were, at times, alarmed, but not always, and they acknowledged that the fire escape provided an unguarded route to the top of the building. No cameras captured Elisa's final movement toward the roof. There were no witnesses, no notes left behind, only that unsettling video, those unfinished blog posts, and a body discovered only after others noticed something wrong with the water supply. To law enforcement, it was a sad but solvable story. A young woman with a known mental health diagnosis, possibly experiencing a psychotic or manic episode, who had accessed a dangerous area and died without anyone noticing. But to the people who had followed the case, who had felt drawn to its uncertainties, the conclusion didn't satisfy. The strangeness had lingered too long. The images had settled too deeply. And the details, however ordinary they may have appeared in hindsight, still felt wrong in shape. But as the public conversation around Elisa's case began to mature, so did the recognition that some of that discomfort was not about her death, but about our need to make sense of things that resist sense. The Cecil Hotel, meanwhile, remained caught in its own slow collapse. The building had always existed in tension, with its glamorous bones, its deeply troubled past, and its inconsistent management. After Elisa's death, any attempts to restore its reputation faltered. For many, the building had become permanently linked with her, and not only because her body had been discovered there, but because the building itself had failed to prevent it. Even if her death had not been a result of foul play, the hotel had offered no barriers, no warnings, no intervention. In the months that followed, bookings dropped. Investigations into other safety concerns resumed. Tenants who lived there long-term grew frustrated with the stream of journalists and tourists who passed through the lobby. Eventually, the Cecil closed again. In 2017, it was designated a historic cultural monument despite, or perhaps because of, its notorious reputation. Plans for redevelopment were announced. The upper floors were slated to be turned into low-income housing. The hotel portion would remain closed for some time, but the story, of course, had already written itself into the building's walls. Elisa's name was now part of its legacy, unintended, undeserved, but permanent. Her family never stepped into the spotlight. They grieved privately, spoke rarely, and when they did, they asked for respect. They had lost a daughter, not a symbol. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit not to rewrite the narrative, but to ask whether more could have been done, whether the hotel had any safeguards in place, whether Elisa's death had truly been as unavoidable as it seemed. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2015. The court ruled that the hotel could not have reasonably foreseen what had occurred, that its responsibility, while important, did not extend to every unpredictable action a guest might take, particularly if they had not been exhibiting obvious signs of distress to staff. For her family, there was no satisfaction in the decision, but there was nothing left to contest. They had Elisa's remains, brought home to Vancouver. They had the truth, as complete as the investigation could make it. And they had the silence that followed, something not unfamiliar to families who lose someone in a way that feels both public and strangely unreachable. In time, Elisa's name became more than a headline, more than a case. It became a reference point in larger conversations about mental health, about online culture, about the human cost of viral storytelling. For many who had first encountered her through the elevator footage, their understanding deepened. They began to see not just a mystery, but a missed opportunity for compassion. A life that had been real and complicated, but also deeply brave. Elisa had not hidden her pain. She had not pretended to be fine. She had tried to share, to articulate what she was feeling. And in the end, what her story revealed was not a conspiracy, but a chasm between what we are willing to acknowledge and what we often overlook. She had done everything she could to be known. It was only after she vanished that the world truly began to listen. Long after her name faded from headlines and the case stopped dominating forums, Elisa Lam remained, quietly and gently, part of a conversation much larger than her final days. Her story never ended with a final statement or a solved mystery. It settled, instead, into the folds of memory, where it lingers for those who still think of her not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a person who lived, tried, wrote, and struggled with things that so many others understand in their own lives. In the years following her death, there has been a quiet but growing shift in how people talk about Elisa. The online fixation with her elevator video, once the focal point of endless speculation, began to lose its grip. And in that space, people returned to her writing. Her blog, preserved by readers and archived across platforms, became something of a time capsule. Not just of her thoughts, but of a generation of young people trying to find a foothold in a confusing and overwhelming world. She had written about loneliness, about the pressure to meet expectations, about the exhaustion that came with mental illness. But she had also written about hope, about books she loved, about wanting to feel real joy, not borrowed or performative, but something she could hold and believe in. These posts, written without the knowledge that anyone beyond a small circle would ever read them, became a voice that felt intimate to those who came to know her only after her passing. It wasn't just that she was articulate. It was that she was honest in a way most people are afraid to be. In that honesty, many found themselves. Elisa's story has become a touchpoint in discussions about mental health. Not as a case study in tragedy, but as a reminder of how important it is to listen before silence becomes final. Her openness about her bipolar disorder, her frustration with treatment, her fear of failure, and her longing for connection. None of it was unique, but all of it was brave. In telling her story without shame, she made space for others to do the same. And yet, her death also reminded people of how fragile those spaces can be. That visibility doesn't always come with protection. That honesty doesn't guarantee understanding. And that being open about suffering doesn't always mean you'll be seen when it matters most. These were hard lessons, and Elisa didn't mean to teach them. But the world learned them anyway. In Los Angeles, the Cecil Hotel remains closed to the public. Its future is still uncertain. Plans for redevelopment have been delayed. The building sits in stasis, neither active nor forgotten. Its windows catch the light during late afternoons. Its rooftop, now sealed and monitored, remains untouched. For some, the place will always be a symbol of unanswered questions. For others, it will be remembered simply as the last place Elisa was seen. But Elisa herself has never been defined by the place where she died. The people who truly remember her, the ones who've read her words, who've listened carefully, know that her life stretched far beyond that building. Her world included the streets of Vancouver, the campus she studied on, the books that filled her shelves, the music she referenced, the photos she took while traveling. Her life was full of attempts to feel well, to stay connected, to make meaning out of things that didn't always make sense. She didn't disappear into the water tank. She was always more than that. Some people still visit her blog. Others write messages in the comment sections beneath videos or documentaries about her, not out of obsession, but out of quiet respect. They thank her. They share their own struggles. They say they wish someone like her had lived longer, had written more, had been recognized for who she was while she was still here. That kind of remembrance, soft, personal, consistent, is what has slowly replaced the speculation. There are still questions, yes, but the mystery isn't the point anymore. The memory is. And in that memory, Elisa Lam continues to exist, not as a symbol, not as a viral video, but as a voice that, even now, continues to echo. There's something quiet about endings we don't fully understand. Not tragic in the dramatic sense, not sudden in the way that demands spectacle, just quietly incomplete. Elisa Lam's story, from the moment it became public, was shaped by that quietness. A vanishing with no witness. A building with too many shadows. A silence that went unnoticed for weeks. And when her voice returned, not through a call, not through a video, but through her writing, it reminded the world of something simple and overlooked, that she had been speaking all along. The mystery had not begun at her disappearance. It had begun in the moments where no one asked more of her than what she had offered. In those blog entries, she wasn't coded or obscure. She had said what she felt, what she feared, what she hoped for. She had been clear. The mystery then wasn't hers. It was ours. It was what we failed to hear while she was still here. Elisa's final journey, from Vancouver to California, had been a decision made with intention. She had wanted to travel, to explore, to see things that were new. She moved alone but not aimlessly. She took photos. She made plans. She visited landmarks and bookstores. She carried the weight of her mental illness, but she carried it with strength. That's something often left out of the conversation. To live with that kind of illness and still choose to move, to go, to try, that is not weakness. That is courage. And for a while that courage held. Until quietly it didn't. In the decade since Elisa's death, her story has touched more people than she could have ever imagined. Her name, once attached to a police report, became attached to questions about safety, mental health, media ethics, and the architecture of empathy. She became, for a time, a symbol of everything that's easy to get wrong when we talk about lives that end too soon. But that's not what she should be remembered for. She should be remembered for how she wrote, softly, intelligently, with humor and openness. For how she tried to explain herself in ways that asked only to be understood. For how she moved through the world with more awareness than most people are ever willing to admit. She was not strange. She was not broken. She was a person trying to understand herself, just like the rest of us. There is a moment in her blog where she describes feeling like a ghost, present but unseen, in motion but without reflection. She wasn't being poetic. She was describing what it felt like to move through life with an illness that made her feel invisible. And yet, in writing it down, she did the opposite of disappearing. She left behind something lasting. A voice. A mirror. A set of words that still reach people years later when they feel like they're vanishing too. There is no plaque for Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel. No physical marker. No flowers left regularly at the building's entrance. But she doesn't need those things to be remembered. She's remembered in the way her name still lingers when people speak of silence. She's remembered in the way her blog still finds readers. In the way people still say, "I saw myself in her words." And in the way that quiet moment in the elevator, grainy, confusing, misunderstood, has slowly been replaced by something clearer. Not a mystery, but a memory. May she rest in peace. And may her voice never be lost again.